Kenechukwu Okafor, known to everyone simply as Chief Keen, was not just a millionaire. He was a symbol of what could be achieved with relentless ambition, tenacity, and a drive that never quit. He had carved out his empire from nothing, transforming his life from the dusty streets of Onitsha to the sparkling skyscrapers of Abuja. Hello, family. Welcome to Storytime Bichuli. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, leave a like for us, and also share this video to your friends and loved ones. Don't forget to turn on post notifications for more videos. Sit back, relax as we dive into this story. To the public, he was the epitome of success, admired by many and envied by even more. His name was whispered with reverence in the boardrooms of the most prestigious businesses, and his face was splashed across the front pages of newspapers. His story, however, was not one that the media often highlighted. Few knew of the hardships he had faced early in life, how he had grown up in a family of modest means, raised by his hardworking mother and an absentee father. Despite being raised in a cramped two-bedroom apartment with 3 other siblings, Keen had always been determined that he would not let his circumstances define his future. As a child, he had spent countless hours tinkering with broken appliances, fixing radios and old television sets for the neighbors. In the evenings, while his peers were outside playing football, he was studying the inner workings of engines, a passion that later translated into his first real business venture, running a small mechanic shop. But that was only the beginning. He wasn't content to simply fix things, he wanted to build things. His thirst for knowledge led him to study engineering, and after graduating from a local polytechnic, he moved to Lagos. There, he found work with a top construction firm. But Keen knew that he wasn't made to be anyone's employee. His big break came when he convinced a few investors to help him launch his own construction company. With grit, sweat, and sleepless nights, Keen built his business from the ground up. The road to success, however, was not without its obstacles. There were moments when Keen thought about quitting, when the weight of failure almost consumed him. There were months when bills piled up and clients refused to pay for the work his company had completed. There were even times when he was forced to borrow money from friends just to make payroll. Yet, through every setback, Keen pushed forward, believing that success was not an event, but a journey. As the years went by, his construction company expanded, and with it, his wealth. He secured major contracts with both the government and private sector, including high-profile real estate projects. He built luxury estates, skyscrapers, and commercial buildings that dotted the skyline of major cities. Each new project was a stepping stone toward his goal of becoming one of the richest men in Africa. But success didn't come without its sacrifices. The more Keen's wealth grew, the more he found himself consumed by his work. His family, which once had been his top priority, began to slip into the background. His wife, Amaka, often joked about his obsession with work, but Keen didn't see it that way. For him, every day at the office was another opportunity to build his legacy, to secure the future of his children. Amaka was his rock. She had been by his side when he was still struggling, when he was just a young man with a dream and a rusted car. She had seen him through the darkest days of his life, when the weight of failure seemed unbearable. Together, they had built their life. They had 2 beautiful children, Chidinma, their 8-year-old daughter, and Chinidu, their 5-year-old son. Amaka was everything Keen had ever wanted in a partner, supportive, kind, and loving. Yet, over time, something had shifted between them. Keen couldn't quite put his finger on it. Amaka no longer looked at him the way she once had. Her smile had become more forced, her laughter quieter. She had grown distant, and despite Keen's best efforts, their relationship seemed to be slipping away from him. He'd been too busy to notice the small signs, the way she no longer asked him about his day, or how she spent long hours on her phone, barely engaging with him or the children. At first, Keen convinced himself it was just the stresses of life catching up with her. She was busy managing their household, raising their children, and managing her own small businesses. She, too, had her hands full. But deep down, Keen knew that there was more to it than that. As the months passed, he found himself yearning for the woman he had once shared his dreams with, the woman who had believed in him when he had nothing. But now, He couldn't help but feel as though they were strangers living in the same house. One night, after a particularly grueling day at work, Keen arrived home late, hoping to surprise Amaka with dinner. As he walked through the door, he noticed her sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to the television. She didn't hear him enter, and when she finally turned to greet him, her smile was absent, almost mechanical. "Amaka," Keen called softly. "How was your day?" Amaka sighed and shrugged. "Same old, Keen. Same old." The answer, though brief, stung more than it should have. Keen tried to hide his frustration, but failed miserably. He sat beside her and reached for her hand, only for her to pull it away gently. "I'm just tired, Keen. It's been a long day." It was at that moment Keen realized how much he had changed, how much their relationship had changed. The woman he had once been so in love with seemed like a distant memory. He had been so focused on his business and wealth that he had neglected the most important thing in his life, his family. But Keen's work didn't slow down. He was driven, obsessed even. He was determined to reach the pinnacle of success. He threw himself into his projects, spending long hours in the office, meeting with contractors, negotiating deals, and expanding his businesses. Yet, with each passing day, his heart became heavier. As the months went by, Keen noticed subtle changes in the people around him, particularly in Donatus, his best friend. Donatus, who had been with him from the very beginning, seemed different. At first, Keen dismissed it as nothing more than stress. Donatus had recently expanded his own business empire, branching out into real estate, and the pressure had taken its toll. They both spent long hours together discussing business matters, but it wasn't the same. Donatus no longer shared the same passion in their conversations. He had become more distant, more distracted. Keen had caught him on a few occasions looking away quickly when Keen entered the room or glancing at his phone in a way that seemed secretive. Still, Keen refused to believe that anything was wrong. Donatus had been his closest friend, his partner in success. They had trusted each other with everything. If something was wrong, surely Donatus would tell him. Yet, Keen's instincts told him otherwise. It wasn't long before Keen began to wonder if the foundation of his perfect world was about to crack. Little did he know, the cracks were already forming, deep and invisible, hidden beneath the surface of his prosperity. The storm was coming, and he couldn't yet see the clouds gathering on the horizon. As he sat in his office one evening, reviewing some financial reports, he received a call from Donatus. It was late, and Keen was just about to head home. "Keen, we need to talk," Donatus said, his voice strained. The words were simple, but they carried an air of urgency. Keen's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Keen's heart skipped a beat as he heard the tone in Donatus's voice. It wasn't like his best friend to sound so unsettled. They had shared countless moments of success, failures, and everything in between. But now, there was a tension between them that Keen couldn't ignore. "I'm listening, Donatus," Keen replied, trying to keep his voice calm. His mind raced. What could it be? A business deal gone wrong? An investment gone sour? "I need you to meet me," Donatus said, his words clipped. "It's not something I can explain over the phone. Please, just meet me." Keen's instincts kicked in. He had known Donatus long enough to recognize that his friend wasn't the type to be vague or elusive. Something had gone terribly wrong. "All right," Keen said, pushing away from his desk. "Where?" There was a brief pause before Donatus spoke again. "Let's meet at the old cafe near your office. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Without waiting for Keen's response, Donatus hung up the phone. Keen stared at the receiver in his hand for a moment, trying to make sense of the conversation. What could possibly be so urgent that Donatus couldn't explain it over the phone? He grabbed his coat and left the office quickly, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The cafe was only a short drive away, but the journey felt longer than usual. His thoughts raced as he navigated through the quiet streets of Abuja. Had something happened to Donatus? Was there trouble with their business ventures? Or was it something more personal? When Keen arrived at the cafe, he found Donatus sitting in a corner booth, his face a mixture of anxiety and guilt. The once confident, jovial friend seemed to have aged 10 years in the past few weeks. Keen sat down across from him, his eyes narrowing in concern. "What's going on, Donatus?" Keen asked, his voice low. "You're scaring me." Donatus looked around nervously, as though checking to see if anyone was listening. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I've made a huge mistake, Keen." Keen leaned in, sensing the seriousness of his friend's words. "What are you talking about?" Donatus swallowed hard before continuing, his hands trembling as they rested on the table. "It's about Amaka and me." Keen's blood ran cold at the mention of his wife's name. He stared at Donatus, disbelief flooding his senses. "What do you mean, Donatus?" Donatus closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing himself for the confession he knew he had to make. I've been seeing Amaka, Keen," he said, his voice barely audible. The words hit Keen like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind raced, but the world seemed to slow down. He stared at Donatus, trying to process what he had just heard. "You've been seeing Amaka?" Keen repeated, his voice shaky. "You've been cheating with my wife?" Donatus nodded, his face contorted with regret. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Keen. I never planned this. But we've been having an affair for months now." Keen felt a wave of anger and betrayal flood through him, but it was quickly replaced by something far worse: disbelief. He had trusted Donatus like a brother. They had built their fortunes together. And now, his best friend had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. "How could you, Donatus?" Keen's voice was cold, his eyes narrowing as he looked at his old friend. "How could you do this to me? To my family?" "I'm sorry, Keen," Donatus said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. Amaka and we were both struggling with our own issues. You've been so consumed with your work, Keen. I know you've been distant with her. She needed someone to talk to, someone to listen. And I—" "Stop." Keen snapped, his voice rising. "I don't need you to explain. I don't need your excuses. You slept with my wife behind my back, Donatus. My wife, the mother of my children." Tears welled up in Donatus's eyes as he reached across the table, but Keen pulled away, his face hard with fury. "I never wanted to hurt you," Donatus continued, his voice pleading. "I thought I could stop it, Keen. But it became so complicated. I fell for her, and she—" "Enough!" Keen shouted, standing up abruptly. The cafe patrons turned their heads at the outburst, but Keen didn't care. He was a man on the edge, his emotions swirling in a storm of rage and betrayal. He turned and stormed out of the cafe, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. How could this have happened? How could Donatus, his closest friend, do this to him? And Amaka, his loving wife, the woman he had spent his entire life building a future with, had betrayed him as well. Keen's mind raced as he walked to his car, the cold night air doing little to calm his boiling anger. He had always known that his marriage was strained, that Amaka had been growing more distant over the years. But he had never suspected this. He slammed the car door shut and drove home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he arrived at the house, the lights were on, and the soft hum of the television filtered through the open window. It was almost as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. As Keen stepped inside, he found Amaka sitting on the couch, just as he had left her hours earlier. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Keen could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between them like a thick fog. "Amaka," Keen said, his voice low and steady, "we need to talk." Amaka's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she said nothing. She didn't move. Keen took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves before the confrontation he knew was coming. "I know about you and Donatus," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. Amaka's face paled. For a moment, she said nothing, as if trying to process the weight of his words. Then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, she spoke. "I'm sorry, Keen. I never meant for you to find out this way." Keen's heart shattered as he stood there, staring at the woman he had once loved, the woman who had broken him in ways he never thought possible. "You're sorry?" he asked, his voice barely audible. You're sorry for betraying me, for breaking my heart? Tears filled Amaka's eyes as she stood up, reaching out to him. Keen, please, Don't touch me, Keen snarled, stepping back. I don't want to hear any more of your lies. I don't want to hear your excuses. You and Donatus both took everything from me. And now, I'm going to make you pay for it. Amaka's eyes widened in fear as Keen's anger took over. He turned away from her, the weight of the betrayal sinking deep into his soul. There was no going back now. The love he had once held for her had been shattered into a million pieces. And Donatus, his friend, his business partner, was no longer a man he could trust. As Keen walked out of the room, he knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but it was one he had to walk. There was no turning back now. The web of deceit had been spun, and Keen was about to burn everything to the ground. Keen paced the length of his study, his mind in turmoil. The events of the past hours replayed over and over in his head. His wife, Amaka, and his best friend, Donatus. Both of them had betrayed him. The woman he had built his life with, the one he had trusted with his heart and soul, had slept with his closest friend. The realization weighed heavily on him, sinking him deeper into a pit of disbelief. How could this have happened? How could it have all spiraled out of control so quickly? The silence in the room was deafening. Keen hadn't even bothered to turn on the lights when he came home. The dark felt more like a reflection of the emptiness that had taken root in his chest. His mind wandered to the good times, the laughter, the dreams, the promises, but they all seemed so distant now, like a story from another life. The familiar hum of the house felt alien to him now. Every step he took through the corridors reminded him of the life he thought he had. He had been wrong, so terribly wrong about everything. His thoughts turned to Donatus. Keen's mind flicked between anger and confusion as he remembered the painful confession his best friend had made. Donatus had been more than just a friend. He had been a brother. They had been through so much together: success, failure, heartbreak, and triumphs. But now, the man he had once considered family had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. How could Donatus have done this? Keen ran his fingers through his hair, trying to shake the thoughts away. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. He needed answers, but the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed to find them. As the minutes ticked by, Keen found himself standing in front of the window, looking out into the night. His gaze was unfocused, his thoughts scattered like the city lights below. What now? The sound of footsteps behind him interrupted his reverie, and Keen turned slowly. It was Amaka. She had entered the room quietly, as if she were afraid of breaking the fragile silence between them. Keen, she whispered, her voice trembling. Keen's fists clenched at his sides as he turned to face her. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked as though she had aged 10 years in the span of one night. But Keen didn't care about her tears. He couldn't bring himself to care about anything she said anymore. I don't want to hear it, Amaka, he said sharply, his voice cold. Don't come near me. Amaka stopped in her tracks, her lips quivering as if she were about to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she lowered her gaze, as though the weight of her guilt was too much to bear. Please, Keen, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I've hurt you, but I never meant for any of this to happen. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. Keen's heart twisted, but his anger only grew. A mistake, he repeated bitterly, his voice rising. This wasn't a mistake, Amaka. You chose to do this. You chose Donatus. You chose to betray me. And now you want to call it a mistake? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? What you've done to our families? Amaka's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped forward, her hands outstretched as if she wanted to comfort him. But Keen stepped back, his body tense. No, he said, his voice firm. I don't want you to touch me. I don't want your apologies. I don't want anything from you anymore. Amaka stopped, her face crumpling as though she were about to break down. She opened her mouth to speak again, but Keen held up a hand, stopping her. Leave me alone, Amaka, he said coldly. Just leave me alone. For a moment, Amaka hesitated. But then, with a broken sob, she turned and left the room. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, and Keen was left standing in the silence once again. He ran a hand over his face, trying to control the storm of emotions that raged inside him. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't remain in this house, surrounded by memories of betrayal and heartache. He needed to get away, to think, to clear his mind. Without a second thought, Keen grabbed his keys and left the house, stepping out into the cool night air. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. But even in the stillness of the night, Keen couldn't shake the gnawing emptiness inside him. Where do I go from here? He drove aimlessly through the city, the sound of the engine the only thing that filled the silence. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but he knew he couldn't go back to the life he had before. Everything had changed. As he drove, Keen's thoughts returned to Donatus. He couldn't ignore the fact that the man who had been his closest friend was the one responsible for this nightmare. Keen's heart hardened as he thought about Donatus's confession. The guilt in his eyes had been obvious, but it didn't change anything. Donatus had done something unforgivable, and now Keen had to figure out how to move forward without him in his life. Suddenly, the thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. What if I confront Donatus? He didn't know why the thought hadn't occurred to him earlier. Maybe it was the fear of confrontation, or maybe he had been too focused on his pain to think about what Donatus had to say for himself. But now, Keen realized that he couldn't avoid it forever. He needed answers. He needed closure. He couldn't move on until he knew why Donatus had done this. Without another second to waste, Keen grabbed his phone and dialed Donatus's number. The phone rang twice before Donatus picked up. Hello. Donatus's voice was hesitant, as though he hadn't been expecting Keen to call. It's me, Keen said, his voice tight. We need to talk. Donatus's silence on the other end of the line told Keen all he needed to know. He could hear the uncertainty in Donatus's breathing, the guilt that hung between them. I'm coming to see you, Keen said. We're going to settle this, once and for all. Donatus didn't reply. There was nothing left to say, Keen realized. The truth had already been laid bare. He was done with the lies, with the broken promises, and with the people who had betrayed him. Keen hung up the phone and steered his car toward Donatus's house. The city streets seemed to blur as he drove, his mind consumed with the thoughts of what awaited him. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he had to do this. As he pulled up in front of Donatus's house, Keen felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew the conversation ahead would be painful, but it was something he had to do. The front door of Donatus's house opened before Keen had even stepped out of the car. Donatus stood in the doorway, looking lost, his face pale and drawn. Keen walked up to him, his steps deliberate. I hope you've been waiting for this moment, Keen said coldly. Donatus's eyes widened as he saw the storm in Keen's eyes, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Keen took a deep breath. You've ruined everything, Donatus. You've ruined my marriage, my friendship, and my trust. And I want to know why. Why, Donatus? Donatus swallowed hard, his eyes filling with regret as he stepped aside, gesturing for Keen to come inside. I don't have the answers, Keen, Donatus said softly, his voice filled with sorrow. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do now is try to make it right. Make it right. Keen scoffed, his anger flaring again. There's no making this right, Donatus. You've already taken everything from me, and I can never forgive you for that. Donatus looked down, his face etched with guilt and sorrow. I never meant to hurt you, Keen. I was weak, too weak to stop myself from falling for her. But it's not just Amaka's fault, Keen. It's mine, too. I failed you, and I know there's no redemption for that. Keen stood in the doorway, his fists clenched, his mind a whirlwind of rage, pain, and confusion. He wanted to scream at Donatus, to lash out, and tell him everything he felt. But instead, he simply turned and walked away. The storm inside him had yet to settle, and Keen knew this was just the beginning. He had lost more than just his marriage. He had lost a part of himself. And the journey to heal, to find peace again, would be long and uncertain. But one thing was clear, he would never forgive Donatus. Not for this. The air outside felt different now, cold, sharper. Keen's breath hung in the night as he walked away from Donatus's house, each step heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The city around him seemed so foreign, as though it no longer belonged to him. The quiet streets, the dim lights, they all felt like mere distractions, masking the pain that churned inside him. His mind, once consumed with thoughts of success and wealth, was now fixated on the betrayal that had shattered his world. Keen wasn't sure where he was going. His car was parked a few blocks away, but he didn't feel like driving. He just needed to walk, to think, to process everything. But no matter how fast he walked or how far he traveled, the images of Amaka and Donatus kept circling his mind like vultures, feeding on his pain. Why did this happen? That question had plagued him for days now, and he still had no answer. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the sense of helplessness that came with it. How could he have been so blind? How had he not seen the signs? Or had they been there all along, and he had simply ignored them because he didn't want to face the truth? The thought of going back to the house, to face Amaka again, made his stomach turn. He couldn't do it, not yet. He needed space, distance. His mind needed time to catch up with the reality of his life. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking through the haze of his thoughts. It was a message from his mother. "Keen, where are you? I've been trying to call. Is everything okay?" Keen sighed, staring down at the screen. He had been avoiding his mother's calls for days now. She had been worried about him, but how could he explain what had happened? How could he put into words the betrayal he had suffered? His parents had always been a rock for him, but this was something they wouldn't understand, not in the way he needed them to. He pocketed his phone and kept walking. The night stretched on, and Keen found himself wandering, without purpose. He passed the cafe where he and Amaka had shared countless cups of coffee during their courtship, the park where they had taken long walks together, the street corner where Donatus had first introduced him to his now former best friend. Everything was a reminder. Every corner he turned felt like another stab to his heart. His life, the one he had built so carefully, was crumbling, and he had no idea how to rebuild it. All the money in the world, all the power, all the success, it meant nothing now. Nothing at all. By the time Keen made it back to his car, his feet were sore, and his mind was weary. He got in and started the engine, the hum of the car filling the silence. He didn't want to go back to the house. But he knew that he couldn't run forever. He drove for what felt like hours, aimlessly meandering through the empty streets, until his thoughts turned to his son, Chuka. The one thing that had remained constant in his life was his love for his child. His son was the only part of his past that hadn't betrayed him. Chuka hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't chosen to be born into a broken home. And yet, Keen realized it was his duty to be strong for him, to be the father his son needed, even if the rest of his world was falling apart. Eventually, Keen found himself at the front of his house. The lights inside were off, and the house seemed empty, cold. He hesitated before walking up the front steps, each movement feeling like a struggle. The moment his hand touched the door handle, he hesitated again. "Do I go in?" He stood there for several moments, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to fix things when the foundation of everything he had known was shattered? But then, as if something in him snapped, Keen pushed the door open and stepped inside. The silence in the house was suffocating. He walked through the hallway and into the living room. The familiar scent of the home, Amaka's perfume, the faint smell of wood polish hit him, but it didn't bring comfort. Instead, it only reminded him of the life that no longer existed. Keen's footsteps echoed as he made his way upstairs. He passed by the room that had once been his and Amaka's sanctuary, the place where they had shared their dreams, their love, their hopes. But now, that room was just a tomb of memories he could never reclaim. He walked to Chuka's room. The door was slightly ajar, and Keen gently pushed it open. His son was asleep, the soft rise and fall of his chest the only indication that life still had some beauty to offer. Keen stood there for a moment, watching his son's peaceful face, and the anger in his chest softened. Chuka hadn't caused any of this. It wasn't his fault that his parents' marriage had crumbled. Keen would protect him, no matter what. He stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Gently, he placed a hand on his son's forehead and whispered a silent promise. "I'll fix this, Chuka. I'll make it right." For the first time in days, Keen felt something stir within him. A glimmer of hope, no matter how small. It wasn't the kind of hope that would make everything better overnight, but it was enough to keep him going. The sound of footsteps from behind broke his moment of reflection. Amaka stood in the doorway, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She hadn't followed him into the room. She stood there, silently waiting, as though unsure if she was even allowed to enter. Keen didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on his son. "You're back," Amaka said softly. It wasn't a question, just a statement. "I'm here," Keen replied flatly. She stepped closer, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Keen, I never meant for this to happen. Please understand. It was a mistake. A horrible mistake, but it wasn't something I planned." Keen closed his eyes, his anger flaring again. "Stop, Amaka. Don't do this. I don't need your excuses. What's done is done. We can't go back." Amaka fell silent, and Keen finally turned to face her. The pain in her eyes was palpable, but Keen couldn't bring himself to care anymore. He had given her everything. He had loved her with all his heart, but love wasn't enough to fix betrayal. Not this kind of betrayal. "I don't know what happens now," he said quietly. "I can't forget this, Amaka. I can't just move past it. I need time to think, to process everything. But I'll be here for Chuka. He's the only reason I'm staying. I don't want him to grow up in a broken home." Amaka nodded silently, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do anything to make it right. Just please, Keen, please don't leave us." Keen took a deep breath. He wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. But something inside him stirred, a whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. But for now, all he could do was take it one day at a time. The story of Keen's betrayal, his heartbreak, and his journey toward healing was far from over. It would take time, more than time. It would take forgiveness, understanding, and effort. But one thing was clear. Keen was no longer the man he had once been. His heart had been shattered, but it was still capable of healing. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to rebuild the life he had lost. For Chuka. For himself. And for a future that was still uncertain, but no longer impossible. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.